important that us teach us. They tell us that in orders to something to establish as a culture and a tradition, that the first thing is you have to have an informative narrative. Second is you create a celebration around the informative narrative. Then you have an education about the informative narrative. So for example, the United States, the informative narratives were a country of liberty and freedom. The celebration is the 4th of July. And the education is 12 years that you spend in school being indoctrinated that this is a land of freedom. The Jews have the God's people, the informative narrative. Then they have the celebration is their Passover. Education is Hebrew school. For us as black and brown people, our informative narrative, unfortunately, is the slave trade. We get our culture from that. Our celebration is just now is Juneteenth because they kept the celebration from us because they didn't want us to establish culture. And the last thing is education, is why they want HBCUs to dismantle because they don't want us to educate us. Amen.
All right. Once a good afternoon. Thank you so kindly. We're almost there at noon, so good morning, good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you so kindly. Born and raised Flint, Michigan, on Midwest side. Live in Tucson, Arizona, and that's where my headquarters is at. That's where my practice is at. And I travel throughout the nation, supporting individuals with trauma. A lot of my work is in early childhood traumas, and I work with school districts throughout the nation. So I'm traveling a lot, 2 to 3 times a month, supporting our school districts, especially our hard-hit school districts, our failing schools, our F schools, schools of behavior, having behavior issues. The 2 big major things that people ask me is about academics and student behavior. And I let them know very bluntly, you have brain injury problems. And tutoring don't fix brain injury problems.
Come on.
Okay? And you cannot suspend your way to a solution. And it's time out that we are arresting too many black kids from the schoolhouse and putting them into the jailhouse expecting real results. Okay, and so I am also the trauma expert for the Arizona Supreme Court by the appointment of our Chief Justice. And so I train 600 judges on how to create trauma responsive courts because too many courts and the judicial system is re-traumatizing our people. We already had our own traumas before contacts with law enforcement in the judicial system, and then now that when we go into the judicial system, they're creating additional traumas to us. And so I'm a traumatologist, certified traumatologist. I am a trauma crisis specialist, a brain health specialist, and a board certified and licensed functional medicine doctor. All that to say is I help the whole person because trauma does not just impact your brain. It impacts the whole person. Trauma impacts your neurology. Trauma impacts your psychology. Trauma impacts your physiology. And certainly trauma impacts your spirituality. And so I get up every day in the morning having the distinguished calling by God to help people heal from their most deepest pain and brokenness. I am a leading trauma expert in this nation. I am an accomplished author and a best-selling author. My first book is called Get Your Mind Right. You cannot change your life until you heal your brain. The second one is that just got released this past January. We are now having even toddlers experiencing racial bias in early childhood education. So today I thank you for having me to come. I am humbled, I am honored to be before you today. But I'm just going to be straight up with all y'all. I ain't playing with nobody. We have to go out and preach the message of healing. And if you're not focusing on creating healing, you are spinning your wheels. I want you to take notes on some of the stuff I'm going to say, because I don't have a PowerPoint in front of me. So I'm going for what I know. Is that okay? No. I'm saying it again. I'm going for what I know. Is that okay?
Yeah.
All right.
All right.
Number one. Trauma may be your history, but it does not have to determine your destiny. We'll say that again. You better catch it. Trauma may be your history, but it does not have to determine your destiny. That's one. The second one I want to say to y'all is, trauma may not be your fault, but it is your responsibility to heal from your trauma. Which means that you didn't get to choose your parents. You didn't get to choose the hood that you lived in. You didn't have a say in your zip code. You had to deal with the deck of cards that was handed to you. But trauma may not be your fault, but it is your responsibility to heal from your trauma. Everybody in here say, why, Dr. Holt?
Why?
I'm glad you asked. I'm going to tell you for free. Because if you don't heal from your trauma, you're going to bleed on people that didn't cut you. And too many times we are hemorrhaging and we're bleeding on people that didn't cut us. That's the deep scientific. Let me give you the application from the revelation of the information. When you're bleeding on people, you're making somebody else pay a debt that when somebody else in your past wrote the check. You're making somebody pay a wage when Ray Ray wrote the check in your past.
Come on.
Are you hearing me?
Yeah.
That's when we are bleeding on people that didn't cut us. When you're bleeding on people, you're burning every relationship. You're burning every bridge. And you are a professional gaslighter. And you're gaslighting everyone that is connected to you. Why is trauma so much of an issue where I have to? Because it's the root cause to many of our issues. And it is certainly a big root cause to mental illness. You wasn't born depressed, so where did depression come from? You weren't born with anxiety. So where did anxiety come from? Somewhere between the cradle and the grave, in the middle of your life, something traumatic happened to you. Or happened to your clients. Or happened to your students. Or happened to your patients that has impacted them to where they are today. So trauma is most of what we call the root cause of what we're going through. So today I got 5 T points that I'm going to talk about today. And the first point is, what is the trouble with trauma? The trouble of trauma, point 1. The trouble of trauma is, it looks in different manifestations. One trauma can be abuse, but abuse is pretty big. It can be physical abuse. It can be verbal. It can be emotional. It can be sexual abuse. Somebody's not nurturing you. Someone is bringing pain to you. And most of the abuse does not come from strangers. Many of these types of abuse is not a stranger danger issue. It's a family member. It's a caregiver. It's spending the night at the wrong house. That's why I don't let my kids spend the night over everybody's house.
That's right.
And I don't even let them do it in some of the family members' house. Because many of the family members is the violation of that safe space. And if you do let your kids spend the night, you need to be a detective and ask a lot of questions.
Yes.
Who's going to be there? Is there boys there? Come on, y'all. Y'all got to talk to me here. You got to be a detective. You got to be protective, because many of the issues that take place come not from stranger danger, but comes from the space that's supposed to nurture and protect you. Are y'all hearing me?
Yes.
So abuse, physical, emotional. Just because you didn't beat somebody, you can kill somebody with words. Death and life is in the power of the tongue. That's why you don't cuss your kids out, and you don't call them MFs. And you don't call them Bs. Y'all gonna get quiet, but I ain't scared of nobody in here. You gotta get real. So abuse, abandonment. Looks like abandonment. Many of our kids are clients of patients, and including you, the adults in the room, probably have exposed of trauma being abandoned, where you should have been nurtured, and you should have been protected, and you should have been looked after, and you've been rejected. And what was wrong with me that my own parents didn't want me? Abandonment, rejection, violence. When we saw in trauma in the 1800s, we began to learn the science of trauma. And we saw that when veterans went to World War I and World War II, and when they came back, it wasn't the same. They began to have insomnia. They began to struggle with nightmares, and they began to suffer from melancholy or depression. And little did we know, we were beginning to get our first science on PTSD. We just didn't call it that at that time. But when you're exposed to violence, and you don't have to go to Iraq for your brain to be traumatized by violence. You can be in Compton, you can be in Flint, Michigan, you can be in Detroit, Chirac, in Chi-Town, in Chicago, you name it, Baltimore, all these major areas, Philly, right, can traumatize your brain with violence, sexual assault, sex trafficking, okay? When people have been in sex trafficking, it rewires your brain. When you've been extremely traumatized, it rewires your brain. I don't think we take into account that racism is a trigger to black Americans in this country. And I can be boldly to say that sometimes it's traumatizing to be black or a person of color in this country because of the impact that racism plays, because of how racism fosters hypervigilance and hyper-arousal, that certainly that it impacts people of color. Trauma with trauma is going through a bad separation or divorce. It's very traumatizing. In my first session, I asked people to raise their hand. How many of you guys went through a really bad breakup, divorce? And I had 80% of my class that raised their hand. So I already knew right then and there, just off that type of a manifestation of trauma had impacted the class. Early childhood trauma is a trouble. Why? Because at key times of brain development, when a child has been traumatized at early ages like 5 and 6 years old, this is crucial because this is going to impact their adulthood if we don't catch that trauma in their childhood. Why is that important? Because when your first year of living on this planet, you have 25% of your brain. When you get 2 years old, you have 50% of your brain. How many of y'all heard of terrible twos before? Yes. Right? But that's some science of terrible twos. Because when your child gets 2, their brain have developed double in 12 months. Mm-hmm. So this is the reason why they're more acquisitive to touch and to grab things, because their brain is on fire. That's how it should be. By the time you are 5 years old, you have 90% of your brain. So you have all the different types of the parietal type of part of your brain, your cerebellum, all of these different regions of the brain. But when you get around 5 years old, the last part of the brain that did not develop yet is your prefrontal cortex, and you don't get full development of your frontal lobe of your brain until you're 25 for women and 30 for men. That's why we're always behind, fellas. Wow. Because scientifically, we are behind when it comes to brain growth, okay? We don't get most of the prefrontal cortex into you around that age. Okay, so that's early childhood trauma. When you have early childhood trauma and they're going through a lot of trauma, the big takeaways is it impacts your PFC and your frontal lobe, and this is important because this is where cognition is, this is where your executive functioning is, and that is key to learning. And when you're going through a lot of trauma and your prefrontal cortex have been impacted negatively because of the things that you've been through, this is why kids are having a struggle in education. Let me go further. This also means that everybody that is misdiagnosing black kids that have a learning disorder is not telling the truth. Mm-hmm. And so I'm going to tell you up front, and ain't scared of nobody in here, that there's nothing wrong with you. Mm-hmm. We've had for many years, people keep telling us something is wrong with us, and that's why we're not learning. No, it's not. It's not because you're stupid. It's because you've been through hell and high water, and if you haven't eaten in 3 days, I'm not paying attention to algebra. All right. So this is what we talk about, trouble that comes with trauma. But then we have secondary traumatic stress, which means that people that work with people with a lot of trauma, your job is impacting you. So if you're going to be a teacher, if you're going to be a social worker, if you're going to be a first responder, if you're going to be a counselor, if you're going to be dealing with behavioral health, if you're going to be an addictions counselor, let me tell you, that's a lot of trauma. And if you're working in a profession with a lot of trauma, if you don't take care of yourself, the trauma that you serve in others is going to impact the professional. Yeah. Are y'all hearing me? Yeah. Okay. So you better pay attention to the signs, and I'm going to talk about some of those signs. So that's what we talk about, the trouble of trauma. The trouble of trauma is 300,000 teachers walked away from the profession in the last 2 years. You know why? Because of compassion fatigue, and because of burnout, and because of COVID, and because of grief, and trying to recalibrate the educational system, and we have done a horrible job on doing that. And because we're focused so much on standardized testing. And we focus so much more on pedagogy instead of personal relationships. Come on. And because we focus more on curriculum but no connection. That's a problem. I'm going to bust your bubble today. The reason why I'm filling your cups is because if I don't fill your cups, what's going to happen is the professional eats the client. And in the classroom, teachers are eating kids. Come on, preacher. Because when you're in survival mode, if you starve enough, we're going to create a classroom full of cannibals. Mm-hmm. Where everybody's eating each other. Mm-hmm. A village that's eating each other cannot move forward. Mm-hmm. So we got to fill our cups. We got to make sure that there's enough deposits on the inside of us. Mm-hmm. Point 2. Types of trauma. We go from trouble with trauma to types of trauma. Types of trauma is a psychological injury to the brain. That's what trauma is. The root word of trauma means wound. And please do not misconstrue trauma with mental illness. Right. Trauma and mental illness is 2 different things. Now, they are interconnected, but they are not entirely the same. Trauma is more of a brain injury. When bad things happen to you, it impacts your brain and creates injuries. Are y'all following me? Yes. When you've been living in poverty, when you've been broke like a joke and you've been tore up from the floor up, that impacts your brain. Okay? There's nothing beautiful about being poor. That's right. And we've been surviving for 400 years, and it's time for us to heal so we can shift from surviving to thriving. That's right. I'm going to say that again because y'all staring at me. Let me talk on this side. Did y'all hear what I said? Yeah. We got to quit just surviving. We got to start shifting to thriving. And we just been in survival mode, just trying to make it to pay bills, that we don't have enough time to develop generational wealth. Right? Okay. So those are some of the things when we talk about the troubles of trauma. So let's look at the types of trauma. The types of trauma is, did y'all catch what I said? What is a trauma? Yes. A wound. All right. Let's try it again. What is trauma? Wound. It's a wound. So when bad things happen to you, it impacts the whole you. Somebody say the whole me.
The whole me.
What you've been through impacts your brain, your mind, your body, and your soul. In other words, scientifically, let me put it this way. That was the street version. Your brain, your mind, your body, your soul. The doctor's version is your neurology, your psychology, your physiology, and your spirituality. I know that was dope. Y'all even your neurology, your psychology, your physiology, and your spirituality. I feel like I'm about to put a few bars and rap on that, right? Hey. So it impacts the whole you. Your brain, your neurology is your brain. Your psychology is the mind. And in my field, that's different. Your mind and your brain is not the same. Okay? So your brain is the physical. Right? That's your neurology. I can do an autopsy on the brain. Have you ever seen an autopsy of a mind? Made you think, didn't it? It's the difference. Right? I can do surgery on the brain. Have you ever heard the surgeon say I'm going to do surgery on the mind? Exactly. It's different. Okay? Physical. And then your spiritual. Okay? Sometimes what has happened to you have hit your soul. I mean, it went deep to the soul of an individual. Okay? So take notes. All right, acute trauma. Write that down. Acute trauma. Acute trauma is a short-term trauma with long-term effects.
Right.
That's acute trauma. So something that traumatically happened to you and it only happened one time, and you were 9 years old, or you're an 8-year-old, or you're 11-year-old, you're a 13-year-old, and now you're 43 and you're still triggered by something that happened to you when you were 9. Number one, you didn't heal from it. And so healing is a journey. All right? Healing is a journey. But you got to understand, I can't conquer something until I first confront it. I got to be real with myself. You got to stop blaming everybody for what you're going through. Y'all hear me? Yes. This is going to hit home, so I know sometimes you probably can't even say anything because I'm just in your Kool-Aid today. But that's my assignment. That's why I'm here. Okay? I'm going to give you some stuff that your doctor and your psychologist have never said to you. Okay? All right, so that's acute trauma. So let me give you an example. Let me get some application of information for the educational purposes. You got in a bad car accident at 9. Your brother and sister got killed in the accident. You miraculously lived that and survived that accident. And here you are, 39. And when you hear brakes screech, you still get triggered by it. That's acute trauma. Okay? Or if you've been sexually assaulted. Okay? Or you've been raped. Or you had something that's very, very traumatic and it only happened one time. And I know many people that have been molested, raped, or sexually assaulted at young ages, and they are now in their 30s and 40s, and it affects their current marriage today because they never went back to what happened to them at 9. And not just females, we're talking about males too.
That's right. That's right.
And sometimes we handle it even worse because it impacts our masculinity.
Correct.
Come on, y'all, talk to me. Right? Okay. So, 2, chronic trauma. Chronic trauma is a long period of trauma, like poverty. Okay? You're not in poverty for 2 days. You can be broke for 2 days.
Right.
But poverty is a whole different type of monster. Okay? That's called chronic trauma. Okay? And that impacts too, because when I've been broke for so long, that makes us go out and hustle. It makes us make wrong decisions. It makes us give into criminal activity. Come on, talk to me, y'all. Everybody ain't out here hustling because they actually want to do it. They're in survival mode. So it makes us make bad decisions. So now our hustling is now criminalized. Does that make sense? Okay.
Too much sense.
Yes. Too much sense. Gotcha. Then it's complex trauma. Complex trauma is when a person is going through various different types of trauma at the same time. Like you were born and raised in poverty, that's one trauma. Then 2, your mama got a live-in boyfriend that's been beating her upside the head. That's domestic violence, so that's a trauma. And because there's been so much violence in the trauma, somebody called Child Protective Services and they come and snatch you out of the family. Now you got separation family. That's a third trauma. Then they put you into an abuse of foster care and you get re-traumatized all over again. That's a fourth trauma. Wow. I'll probably explain a lot of people in here or some of your clients. Come on, y'all.
That's right.
Are y'all hearing me?
Yes.
Okay, so that's what we would consider complex trauma. Then there's another trauma called generational trauma. And many of us are victims of generational trauma because we're still fighting the racial struggle from our ancestors from the 1600s and chattel slavery. And generational trauma is important because if you don't address your trauma in your generation, there's a probability your grandkids is going to go through the same thing you're going through. Make sense? And believe it or not, some stuff you inherited from your great-great-grandparents, and you didn't even know why you had the proclivities that you had. And then you start hearing stories, you start finding out, oh, that's what that came from. Generational trauma comes from being in toxic relationships. I'm pausing because it's not because I ain't got nothing to say. I just want you to marinate. By show of hands, how many of you guys have been in a toxic relationship or toxic marriage? Raise your hand. See. No, let's be real. Be real. Put your hands up. You've been in a toxic relationship or a bad divorce.
I'm gonna just stand up.
Break up. All right. Did you notice that's mostly everybody in the room? Let me ask that again. I said, did you notice that's mostly everybody in the room? Okay? So, and I just talk about one trauma. And just about everybody felt some type of traumatic experience by that. So that lets you know, and you guys are the professionals. You're the professionals, and just about 80 to 90%, everybody has their hands up about being negatively impacted by just relational trauma. Okay? So that's a type of trauma, and that all affects us. And trust me, I'm asking these questions and going somewhere, and I'm going to get to a landing space. I'm just filling the room and assessing the room, and I'm giving y'all a free psychological evaluation today. Free 95, 90 days same cash. Right? And then there's something called secondary trauma, which I alluded to a little bit, is that when you keep working with a whole lot of people with trauma, you're going to get impacted by the people that you're serving. So you're also going to have to learn how to set some boundaries and quit trying to be a messiah to everybody and saving everybody. And start working on yourself. Because if you are the precious gift and you cannot serve from an empty cup. That's correct. And so I'm going to talk about, is your engine light on? And has it been buzzing for a long time? You've been ignoring that engine light. Correct. And I bet you a lot of y'all are guilty of that. Yes, indeed. Many of you would take care of your car more than your own body. Huh? Yeah. As soon as the fuel light on, engine light on, oh, I got to take it to the dealership. And you about to have a stroke, and you say, "No, I ain't going to no doctor. I ain't going to no doctor." Right? Okay, so that's letting you know something is drastically off. All right? So, point 3. Trauma impacts the brain and the body. It impacts your prefrontal cortex. It impacts your amygdala, your hippocampus, your thalamus, your hypothalamus, pituitary, adrenal axis,
That's a lot.
your sympathetic nervous system, your parasympathetic nervous system. It impacts your immune systems. People with a lot of trauma and stress get sicker faster and recover slower than everybody else. And then trauma impacts your body. It impacts your digestive system. This is the reason why you have a lot of gas and bloating, constipation, acid reflux, nausea, all the nasty stuff, diarrhea, And you thought Toms and gas sex was going to fix that.
It does not.
It do not fix it.
No.
You know why? Because that's not the root cause. It's just a symptom of something going on. And the upset of your stomach and the sensitivity, we call it sensitivity, food sensitivity, is letting you know that there's something deeper going on. Does that make sense? Okay?
So don't.
Right? Don't fix it.
Functional
10
medicine.
minutes? Okay. So, what time is it? 10 after, okay. So, it impacts your brain and body. And fourthly, it has your triggers. Write down the 3 E's of trauma. The 3 E's of trauma is your experience, events, and exposures. Experience, events, and exposures. Which means that I can be traumatized not just by experiencing myself, I can be traumatized by other people's exposures. So think about that. It creates hyperarousal, dissociation, detachment, and gaslighting. So what you are going through impacts everybody else. It impacts you, it impacts everybody else, and that's why you need to deal with your trauma. And when we talk about black trauma, it's black trauma, it's because black Americans' trauma is different from the average American's trauma. I'm going to tell you something else for free. Y'all want to know something else for free?
Absolutely.
Black secrets in the house is killing us.
You better go ahead.
These
You better
black
tell
secrets,
it.
these Latino secrets, these communities of color secrets is hurting the communities of color. If our kids is being touched and violated, teach your kids to tell somebody. And don't penalize them from coming out telling you the truth. Don't attack the kids, go after the perpetrator. Black secrets is one of the big causes of suicide ideations. Because they've been for years holding in, being violated and raped and touched and molested and abused, and they had nowhere to go with it. And they were scared to go to their mama because they felt their mama would accept the boyfriend over the kid. And so you see, so what happens is when people have been traumatized and violated, you see it in ridiculous behavior. And then that's a problem because then we stigmatize bad behavior as being this is a bad girl or a bad boy, but we didn't talk about the bad event or the bad experience that created the behavior. Y'all really don't want me to go deeper than this.
Go ahead.
I'm also going to tell you some of our black trauma come from black churches.
What?
So some folks ain't going to church because they don't love God. They have been abused in the house of God.
Wow.
I don't know about that. We should not go to church and be bullied from the pulpit. We should not go to church and be and be humiliated by the mothers of the church. You know where I'm going with this stuff, right? And so we just excuse the behavior. Oh, that's just them. No, you got to quit allowing the church to be a slaughterhouse and be a hospital for the sick. Are y'all hearing me? So when we talk about black trauma, we got to talk about all these different spaces so that we can start the healing process. Okay? So I'm running out of time, so let me shift over to the good side. And that is, do me a favor and find you a good neighbor.
Good name.
And that didn't look ridiculous, then you sitting at the wrong table. Don't even talk to me. Don't even waste your time. Look at your neighbor, say, neighbor. Congratulations. Because you have survived the worst seasons of your life. At this time, no matter what storm have hit your life, no matter what tragedy hit your life, you have survived 100% of it. Oh, I didn't say you didn't cry. I didn't say you had some hard heels to climb, but I am saying whatever came at your door at this point, you have survived 100%. So as you know, a preacher got to have a close, right? Got to have a close. So let me close. You are not stuck with the brain that you have. Now, in church, I'll be shouting right now. You are not stuck with the brain that you have. There's something called neuroplasticity, which means that you can rewire the brain to learn new habits. Isn't that exciting? That means that whatever you've been going through, that's not the end of your journey. We can rewire the brain to have neuroplasticity, and you can learn from the behavior. So what should I be doing to make some change? Number one, you need to get you a doctor. In the black community, we don't like to get help. Talk to me, y'all. That's why you got anger issues. Because you've been bottling up all that trauma since you've been 8. You didn't have a father in your life. You don't even have a relationship with your father. Some of y'all ladies, you and your mother's relationship is toxic. It's gaslighting. You really don't have anybody to go. And all your sisters are competing against each other. So Thanksgiving is traumatizing. Are y'all here? We got all this avoidance. And what this does is when you have a lot of trauma that you don't deal with, it opens the door for addiction behavior. So people that's doing drugs didn't grow up wanting to be an addict for their life. It's because they're using the drugs to help them cope with the trauma that they never dealt with. So now you got two problems. You still got the same trauma when you were 8 years old, you never identified, and now you got crack cocaine addiction on top of it. And so even in rehabs, to really fix addictive behavior, you got to find the root cause. Because if you don't, you're going to keep relapsing. Over and over and over again till you find the root cause. Go see a doctor. 2, get you a therapist. Okay? I ain't say any therapist. I'm talking about culturally relevant, culturally competent therapists. People that understands the black struggle, what it means to live in the hood, and y'all ain't talking to y'all know what I'm talking about. You know the struggle, okay? You can't be in white fragility and white privilege and understands what it's like to live on food stamps and welfare. You understand that? You're far removed from the struggle, okay? So you want to make sure it's culturally relevant, culturally competent, okay? Change your diet, eat better. Okay? As I told you, a lot of stuff you're going through in the brain is impacting your body. It also makes cancer cells more aggressive in your body when you got too much stress. It's hard for chemo to work and radiation to work when you got all that stress in your body so you can heal from cancer cells. Does that make sense? Yes. What does that look like? Psychotherapy, which is talk therapy. Okay? Some people respond good to that. Hypnotherapy may be good for you. EDMR, cognitive behavioral therapy. All these different art therapy. There's so many different types of techniques. Meditation, mindfulness. Many of these different things will work. But you also need to fuel your body with the right stuff, which means you need to look at your vitamin deficiency. If you're low on vitamin D's, if you're low on vitamin B's, you're going to have a hard time dealing with depression and regulating your mood swings. Okay? So these are some things I want you to consider and think about. Many of this stuff I'm teaching today is 6-hour courses. So I only have a little under an hour to tell you some of this stuff. So I'm just about out of time. Listen, work on yourself. Be honest with yourself. Stop blowing up every relationship in your life because you're mad as hell. Deal with your anger. Anger came from somewhere. You weren't born with it. Find the root cause, no matter how difficult that may be. But work on yourself, okay? Why am I asking you to work on yourself? Because you are called to make an impact in somebody else's life, and you can't do that when you're leading and bleeding at the same time. You're leading and bleeding. You're hemorrhaging. You got to patch up your wounds, right? when the flight attendant, I'm closing, you know, you gotta have 3 closes, right? So, someone says, this is my final close. Hold on, right? The picture, I want you to picture you're on an aircraft and you got a flight attendant and you have your passengers on the aircraft. And then the plane is going through a turbulent situation and the oxygen mask falls out of the ceiling and everybody's trying to put it on. The first thing the flight attendant does before she go help other people with their mask, she puts hers on first. And how many of y'all can't breathe because you're not putting on your oxygen mask while you're serving up? I want you to know as I'm closing, listen, the engine light is on, but are you paying attention? And I said in the first session, you should not have 500 hours of vacation time. That's a sign you're not doing enough for yourself. I don't want to hear y'all talking about, well, I feel guilty. What's going to happen to my clients if I take vacation? Somebody else going to take care of it until you get yourself back. Take care of yourself. Let me say this. For those that don't want to take care of yourself, it's possible you're going to stress yourself out and have a stroke or have some type of aneurysm in the brain and you die and succumb to your injuries. And most everybody here is not going to your funeral. And Human Resources is going to post your position. And the only thing you had to say about it is you felt bad about taking care of yourself. Your obituary going to say, and she said she didn't want to take care of herself. That makes no kind of sense. This building, or any building you're working at, is going to be here when you get back. Take care of yourself. Your family is tired of you coming home exhausted, moody, irritable, have no energy to spend time with your spouse and your kids because you gave the loaf of bread to your job and all they get is the breadcrumbs when you come home.
Talk to somebody.
So as I take my seat, take care of yourself.
Yes, sir.
Take care. Yes, sir.
I just got a question for you. I think you're cute, aggressive. You mentioned something about a kid developing their brain at a young age. At 5 years old, a kid experienced a major crisis, trauma. How do they deal with that? Like, I mean, I know you're saying that their brain is, I think, 50% at 2 years old, but at 5, as a child experiencing a serious crisis, they really don't, I mean, even though their brain is 90%, you said, they, you know, like, how do they deal with that? How do they process that?
We need to make sure our kids is getting the help that they need. And so when we find out that they have experienced some traumatic experience, it is very important that, number one, we start doing interventions very, very early, especially during key times of brain development, so their trajectories can be more promising as they become older. So one of those things will look like is obviously trying to get them some early therapy, but even more powerful than therapy and medication is the power of love. Love is the most powerful therapy, that's more powerful than any antidepressant that we've seen. So when we start working with people that is getting the love and they're feeling safe shifts that brain from being hyper aroused to being more in a calming state. So we balance out your sympathetic nervous system that keeps you in a fight or flight or freeze, and we balance it with parasympathetic system so you can be more calm. And that brings back cognition and executive functioning to the brain and the motor skills that we need so kids can learn.
Yes. Dr. Denise said that you would be closing out, so I don't know.
Thank you, and go to your next class.